Okie dokie, this is the American Revolution. It's Section 2, the battles and the Treaty of Paris, 1783. The next chapter is actually about the outcomes of the American Revolution, but this is actually the last on this chapter, the last of this chapter. So let's see where we go. Of course, we go all the way back to Lexington and Concord because we're looking at the battles. We know quite a bit about it because of April Morning. British General Thomas Gage set up a sneak attack in the early hours of April 19, 1775. He sent his troops out of Boston to Lexington under Major Pitcairn. They were supposed to capture radical patriot leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and then they would determine they were somewhere in Lexington. Remember, that's mentioned in the book. Then they were to march on to Concord and get all of the traitors' gunpowder. They had a problem. There were spies and sympathizers to the Patriots' cause who would warn the Patriots that the British were indeed coming. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott, among others, did write to warn the Patriots. However, they did not yell, "The British are coming." They wouldn't yell that because they were British too. Most likely, they simply warned that the King's troops were coming. And okay, this is actually a National Park Service map that shows the routes of the messengers. Now, the troops would have been located right here. This is the Charles River. If you look at it, that's actually a river, and the troops have to cross that river. That's what they're talking about, them coming by water. We see up here that this is Paul Revere's route. Okay, so he went north and then down to Minutemen Road, and then rode on from there to warn people. Okay, down here we see Dawes' route. Dawes' route is in green, and he went from the south and warned people all along. The British patrol stopped Revere, Dawes, and Prescott. Prescott joined them here after they left from Concord, so he joined them in Lexington. Coming back down here, a British patrol actually stopped Revere, Dawes, and Prescott. Revere was captured, Dawes flees back to Lexington, and Prescott escapes to continue to Concord and beyond. I have to look up and see what happened to Revere. Maybe you all should do that. I know he doesn't get executed. Okay, from there, they continued on, and the ones that could continued on and warned. Okay? Now, word about Lexington and the Minutemen. Word spread, the militias from all the towns set up to help their fellow colonists in Lexington and Concord. The colonial militias were originally assembled to defend against Native American attacks and French attacks during the French and Indian War, but Native American first. Minutemen from these militias could literally be ready in a minute to fight, which is why they were called Minutemen. It's not known who shot that first bullet at Lexington on the Lexington Green. But there were about 240 British soldiers from the advance guard there, and like in April Morning, about 70 militiamen. From one British officer's account, a British officer by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Smith, he does say the shot came from the colonial side. The shot is called famously the shot heard round the world. The Revolutionary War had begun with the deaths of 7 militiamen. Concord. Now remember that Concord is where they had stored, where the British knew that they had that the Patriots had stores of gunpowder. But what happened was, by the time they got down to Concord, there were new regiments that had, joined the advance guard of the British from their troops, the King's troops, and they marched from Lexington to Concord. But the American militias were ready for them, as we know, and stopped their advance at Concord. The British retreated back to Boston, and as we know, they got hit with colonial snipers along the way. According to ushistory.org, during the battles of Lexington and Concord, 73 British soldiers had been killed and 174 wounded. 26 were missing. Lord Percy, who led the British back into Boston after the defeat suffered at Concord, wrote back to London, "Whoever looks upon them, the rebels, as an irregular mob will be much mistaken." 3 British major generals, William Howe, Henry Clinton, and Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, and you'll hear more about him, both Howe too, were brought to Boston to lend their expertise and experience to the situation, because things were much more serious than the British in London had realized. Fury over the attacks at Lexington and Concord brings in new recruits. Samuel Adams and others took advantage of the attacks at Lexington and Concord to bring in new recruits. They spread propaganda through the committees of correspondence about what had happened. One of the things that happens from that is people like Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen joined the cause. Benedict Arnold originally was a patriot. Arnold, a militia commander, joined from New Haven, Connecticut. He used his own money to outfit a Massachusetts militia, and with everything they needed, he was quite rich, and set out after Fort Ticonderoga in New York to get artillery, because he knew there was artillery there from the French and Indian War. At the same time, in modern-day Vermont, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys also went after Fort Ticonderoga. They had the same idea. Arnold and Allen didn't want to work together, but in the end they did. May 10, 1775, they took down Fort Ticonderoga in a surprise attack. Fort Ticonderoga was at that point, a British fort, actually, because of the French and Indian War, the outcome of it. So if you look at this little map over here, this is the actual fort, and this is where arms and artillery would have been kept. This is the lower town with the stockade. This is where they were raiding. This is where they wanted to get cannons and guns and gunpowder and bullets, etc. They were quite successful at doing that. Bunker Hill, which is actually Breed's Hill. Under Artemas Ward's command on June 16th of 1775, American troops were supposed to go to Bunker Hill to set up a spot where they could attack the British in Boston. They did go there, but they set it by mistake on Breed's Hill, which was actually closer to the British's position in Boston. On the next slide, you'll see a map of all of this. Early that morning, British Major General William Howe followed British military tradition, which was to attack when threatened, even though the American spot on Breed's Hill was tactically superior and included cannons pointed down at the British. Howe could have attacked only by water, but he must have thought the Americans would run at the sight of his troops. They didn't. While they did fire on the Americans from their ships, they also marched on them. The American troops waited until they were 15 paces away, the famous wait until you see the whites of their eyes, and let bloody fury loose on them. The British attacked and retreated twice. The third time, the Americans were low on ammunition, and the British did secure Breed's Hill. But the cost to the British were great. 1,054 British redcoats were wounded or killed out of the 2,300 that attacked. Now, let's look at why this is actually called Bunker Hill instead of Breed's Hill. Okay, as you look at the map, what you are going to see is actually looking down here at the bottom. This is Boston across the Charles River. Okay, so what we have is Howe brings his troops across, and let's see, I'm looking to make sure I've got everything set up correctly. They could have just fought here, but what they do is, here's Howe over here. They bring people across from Boston, but then he also brings his people against Breed's Hill. And what his plan was to push everybody back and take control of Bunker Hill. Well, he never did take control of Bunker Hill. What happens is that the Patriots retreat to Bunker Hill. And that's why this is called the Battle of Bunker Hill. That really should be the Battle for Bunker Hill. But what it actually was is the Battle of Breed's Hill. Okay, and it's one of those wars where, yeah, the British ultimately won because the Patriots retreated, but it was the moral victory of it took them 3 tries, and they did take down almost half of the troops in that. And that showed the British that the Patriots were serious, and it gave the Patriots the realization that they could do this. Another really important point about the battle for Bunker Hill, or the battle at Bunker Hill, is war. That's the outcome of it. Because, now remember, it takes several weeks, but when the king heard of the attack at Bunker Hill, King George III issued a proclamation of rebellion. It was a now officially war. If you look at the Proclamation of Rebellion, first of all, don't laugh at the language. The printers back then often used what looked like an F for an S. And so this is by the king a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. I think I need more coffee. Actually, I haven't had any. I need coffee. It's like 6:30 on Tuesday morning. I hope you're enjoying your spring break. I'm enjoying mine. So anyway, this starts off, whereas many of our subjects in diverse parts of our colonies and plantations in North America, I don't know what that word is, muffled by dangerous and ill-designing men, and forgetting the allegiance which they owe to the power that has protected and sustained them, after various disorderly acts committed in disturbance of the public peace, to the obstruction of lawful commerce, and to the oppression of our loyal subjects carrying on the same, have at length proceeded to an open and avowed rebellion by arraying themselves in hostile manner to withstand the execution of the law, and traitorously preparing, ordering, and levying war against us. And it goes on from there. Okay, and he declares war. So on July 2nd, that was actually, a proclamation was actually made in August 23rd of 1775. Okay, on July 2nd of 1775, George Washington takes formal command of the American Army at Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, he was chosen because he was from Virginia and he had military experience. This was a tactical choice because the Second Continental Congress recognized the fact that involving people, especially important people from other colonies outside of New England, had to be done to be successful in this war for independence. So they purposefully looked for someone outside of the New England colonies, and that's why they chose George Washington, because he was from Virginia, a quote-unquote southern colony. The Battle of Saratoga. This is one that's so important to our freedom. This battle is the turning point of the war. October 1777, 5,895 British and Hessian troops are surrendered and turned over their arms at the Battle of Saratoga. They were under the command of General John Burgoyne. 86% of his forces were gone from that war. Now I need to give you the background that's going to take us to the Battle of Saratoga. The initial plan had been for Burgoyne's troops to march southward from Canada to Albany, New York, where his troops were supposed to meet with Sir William Howe's troops, who were supposed to come up to Albany from New York City and New Jersey to completely cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. But Howe decided to move south to Philadelphia to take the capital city. While that seemed like that might be a really important tactical move, that decision actually became the most significant mistake the British make in this war. Burgoyne's troops took Fort Ticonderoga. Once again, they took it back. In fact, they didn't even have to fight. The colonists saw them coming and retreated because they realized the troops at that point were far too many for them to fight. The troops retreated. They met with the Burgoyne's troop met the American colonists at Hubbardton, where the British did win, but Burgoyne's use of Native Americans who did things such as scalp colonists like Jane McCrae worked against him because it fueled colonial desire to join up against him. McCrae had been a loyalist. Okay, now a lot of her family were patriots, but the Indians scalp her, and actually her death becomes romanticized. It becomes a huge propaganda point, actually. Remember what I told you about propaganda? Propaganda itself is neither good nor bad. It's how it's used and what it's used for. But her death becomes highly romanticized and actually becomes the subject of a poem that's turned into a song, and it also becomes a play and is used by James Fenimore Cooper in The Last of the Mohicans. But it's a rallying cry against the British, because the British, Burgoyne in particular, were allowing the Native Americans to be brutal, and they were using them against the colonists, against the patriots, and against anybody, it appeared. Burgoyne did continue on to Albany, but the further his troops got from Canada, the less supplies they had. He sent Hessians, remember the Germans that were hired to help with the war, to Vermont to take supplies from the artillery depot at Bennington. When they got there, the Hessians lost to the Americans under General Stark's command. General Schuyler made sure crops and supplies were burned along the route Burgoyne planned to take to weaken the British. Okay, To add to American strengths, General Gates goes to New York to take over troops there. Continuing on the road to the Battle of Saratoga, what happens is the two armies meet on September 19th, 1777 at Freeman's Farm north of Albany. The British actually prevailed, but they suffer a huge human loss. And remember, they have fewer and fewer supplies. Then, finally, we get to Saratoga. Gates put his, oh gosh, I think it's Gates. Now I got to look that up. I'll check in a minute. Put his American army between Albany and the British army. They met just south of Saratoga, with Burgoyne striking first. It didn't matter. The American army was able to decimate 86% of the British troops because they were so weakened by now. Okay? This saved the American cause. The Americans had suffered the loss of the capital at Philadelphia. They needed this huge victory to keep up morale and the fight for freedom. But more importantly, this win gave the French the confidence to become an American ally, and that changes everything. The French alliance, which allows for the wins. Okay, the French wanted to take revenge for huge losses to the British in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, whatever we want to call it. It's the same thing. In 1774, Vergennes, a French foreign minister, sent secret spies to the colonies to see how devoted the colonists were to independence, trying to figure out if he wanted to support them. In 1776, Silas Deane was sent by the Continental Congress to see if he could secretly arrange arms purchases. He also explored the French political and troop assistance idea. Could they come and help us? In 1776, though, Ben Franklin goes to Paris, gets some assistance, but the Treaty of Alliance, which is the treaty that says we're going to fight together against the British. If the British come after the Americans, the French will help. If the British come after the French, the Americans will help the French. And then the Treaty of Amity, friendship, amigos, the most favored trade partners with maritime provisions, is also signed with the French in December of 1777, and that changes everything. Franklin negotiated them with Vergennes' help, who had heard Lord North of the British Prime Minister during most of the Revolutionary War. Remember, he was British Prime Minister for 12 years. He was offering to end the war with concessions that would have given the colonists quite a bit, but kept them under British control. Well, Vergennes heard about that, and he was like, no, this is too late. We're going to negotiate, and the French are going to help the Americans get total and complete independence, and of course be French allies. So with that said, the Battle of Yorktown becomes the last major battle of the American Revolutionary War, and it's recognized as the last battle, the last important one, and it's the end. It's recognized, I guess, as the end of the American Revolutionary War. In 1780, with the arrival of the French, like commanders Lafayette and Rochambeau, along with their troops, this revitalized the American fight. 1781 saw the siege at Yorktown, Virginia, where Lord Cornwallis had a huge army waiting for fresh supplies and troops from home. But the French and Americans determined to keep that from happening. The French Navy under Admiral de Grasse came north from the West Indies. Washington moved his troops 300 miles south along with the French unit. But George Washington did something brilliant, along with those French and his own troops, obviously. They staged mock military maneuvers along the way to throw off the British as to where they were really going. When Washington and the French troops got to Virginia, he joined up with Lafayette, who was leading American troops too. Remember, they're circling around. They surrounded Cornwallis's troops by land and sea, Chesapeake Bay, and Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. This shows the siege of Yorktown. If you take a look at it, what you'll see is here is the French Navy, okay, and they are firing at where Lord Cornwallis's troops are. This is where the troops are for Cornwallis, okay? And here are all of George Washington's troops, and here are all of Lafayette's troops. And they're all headed that way. Cornwallis has no choice but to surrender, and that's the end, quite frankly, of the Revolutionary War. With the end of the Revolutionary War, of course, now we have to have a treaty. So 20 years after the first treaty, the French and, that ended the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, we now have the Treaty of Paris, 1783. It's very, very important that you realize the difference in those two dates. 1763 is the French and Indian War. 1783 is the end of the American Revolutionary War. There were still a few battles. Remember, it takes it could take up to 3 months to get across the ocean with knowledge, with information. Usually it took about 6 weeks. But weather was a big factor. All right, so there were still some battles, but back in England, the English public was crying out for the war to end. They'd had enough. In fact, so much so that when they went to elections, they elected a pro-American parliament in March of 1782. So peace negotiations started. Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, along with others, met with British officials in Paris. The Americans skillfully played the French and British against each other to get what they wanted. The British ceded all the land to the Mississippi River because that's all that they owned at that point. Remember that. And recognized the USA. It's all that they owned from the French and Indian War. Okay. They recognized the USA as a country of its own. The Americans agreed to pay any pre-war debt that they owed to British merchants, and they agreed to stop persecuting loyalists. And we have the United States of America. This painting is awesome because it's Benjamin West's painting of the delegations at the Treaty of Paris: John Jay, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Henry Lawrence, and William Temple Franklin. The British delegation refused to pose, and the painting was never completed. Don't you love how he left it blank? Because that's where the British were supposed to be. Apparently there was somebody sitting or leaning in here, but he leaves it blank because the British were that upset about what had happened. It's kind of cool. Okay, you know what to do. Collaborate. Find someone to collaborate with. Write your questions and your answers.